What if the man you humiliated in the lobby turned out to be the reason your company still exists? Have you ever seen someone misjudged just because of how they looked? Comment 1 if yes, 2 if it happened to you. This question hung in the air of the Lexington Grand Hotel, where the boundaries of perception and reality were about to collide in a moment that would change lives forever. It's a story that reveals the truth behind appearances and reminds us of the extraordinary power of humility, kindness, and dignity. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. We'd love to know where this message is reaching. The Lexington Grand Hotel stood as a monument to luxury in downtown Los Angeles. Its marble floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, and the air held the scent of fresh coffee and white lilies. It was a sanctuary for the wealthy, where success was not just celebrated, but expected. On this particular Thursday afternoon in November, the usual hum of refined conversation and muted business calls filled the space. Hotel staff moved with practiced efficiency, their uniforms pressed to perfection, their smiles calibrated to convey both deference and discretion. Among the guests stood Marshall Trent, the 47-year-old CEO of Trent Technologies, a rising star in the tech industry whose facial recognition software had recently been acquired by 3 major security firms. His tailored Italian suit and platinum watch weren't just accessories, they were statements of his arrival in the upper echelons of corporate America. Marshall was engaged in conversation with 2 potential investors, his voice carrying the confident cadence of someone accustomed to being heard. The fourth quarter projections are conservative, gentlemen. We're anticipating a 30% growth, minimum. The glass doors at the entrance slid open with a whisper, admitting a gust of cold air, and with it, a figure that seemed out of place in this tableau of affluence. A man in his early 60s shuffled into the lobby, his movements deliberate, as though each step required calculation. He wore a faded gray coat that had once been of good quality but now hung loosely from his frame. His shoes, worn at the heels and scuffed along the sides, made a soft scraping sound against the polished floor. His face, weathered by age and hardship, bore the dignified resignation of someone who had seen much of life's harsher truths. The concierge, a young woman named Eliza, glanced up from her computer, her practiced smile faltering momentarily. She had been trained to handle this kind of situation with diplomacy, but before she could approach, Marshall Trent had already noticed the newcomer. Marshall excused himself from his conversation and crossed the lobby, his footsteps echoing on the marble. The other guests watched from the corners of their eyes, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. "Excuse me, sir," Marshall began, his voice carrying the artificial politeness that barely masked contempt. "This isn't a shelter. You need to leave." The homeless man looked up, his blue eyes clear and surprisingly steady. There was no anger in his gaze, no defensiveness, just a calm acceptance that suggested he had encountered this reaction before. "I just wanted to sit for a moment," he said softly, his voice carrying the slight gravel of age but also the careful enunciation of education. "It's getting cold outside." Marshall scoffed, his lips curling into a smirk that he didn't bother to hide. "You can sit outside. We don't allow loitering inside. People like you." He paused, glancing around to ensure he had an audience. "You scare away our clients. This is a business, not a charity." The lobby had grown quieter. A young couple seated near the fireplace exchanged uncomfortable glances. The bartender at the small lobby bar paused mid-pour. Eliza, the concierge, shifted her weight from one foot to another, her training on guest service suddenly at odds with her sense of basic human decency. But no one spoke. The homeless man nodded slowly, as if he had expected nothing less. His dignity in the face of humiliation was its own quiet rebuke. "I understand," he said, beginning to turn toward the door. But then, almost as an afterthought, he reached into his weathered coat and pulled out a worn photograph. The edges were frayed, and a crease ran across its center, but the image was clear enough, a younger version of himself in military dress uniform, standing proudly beside a flag. "I used to stay here," he murmured, more to himself than to Marshall. "Years ago. Before everything changed." Marshall gave a short, dismissive laugh that echoed harshly in the suddenly silent lobby. "What's next? You're going to tell me you own the place?" He turned to Eliza, his expression hardening. "Security, please." The homeless man carefully returned the photograph to the inside pocket of his coat, a gesture so tender it seemed he was handling something far more precious than paper. He picked up a small, worn duffel bag that had rested by his feet, nodded once to no one in particular, and walked back toward the entrance. The doorman, a tall man named Thomas who had worked at the Lexington for 15 years, opened the door with professional courtesy but could not meet the older man's eyes. As the door closed, the man took a seat on one of the stone benches that flanked the hotel entrance, pulling his thin coat tighter around himself as the late autumn wind picked up. Inside, the lobby resumed its normal rhythm, though a faint discomfort lingered like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious melody. Marshall returned to his investors with a self-satisfied smile, as if he had just performed some necessary but unpleasant task to keep their world turning smoothly. "Sorry about that, gentlemen," he said. "Now, where were we?" Yes. The projections. Outside, the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The homeless man sat motionless, staring at the ground, his hands clasped together, not in prayer, but as if he were holding on to something invisible and precious. 15 minutes passed. The valet staff moved efficiently around the circular drive, retrieving and parking vehicles for arriving and departing guests. A sleek black Lincoln pulled up to the entrance, and the driver stepped out to open the rear door. A figure emerged, dressed in black with a quiet elegance that required no announcement. Keanu Reeves moved with the unassuming grace that had become his signature, nodding briefly to the driver and declining assistance with his single black duffel bag. "Do you think someone's past should change how we treat them?" Comment, "Yes, if everyone deserves a second chance," or "No, if you think respect must be earned every time." As he approached the entrance, Keanu noticed the man seated on the bench. He slowed his pace, observing how the man huddled against the cold, his thin frame trembling slightly despite his obvious effort to remain composed. Keanu's brow furrowed slightly, but he continued inside, his thoughts unreadable. The effect of his entrance on the hotel lobby was immediate. The staff straightened their posture, genuine smiles replacing professional ones. Guests turned subtly, some doing double takes as they recognized the actor. Marshall Trent, who had been concluding his meeting, immediately moved toward the entrance, his hand already extended. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his voice now warm with the reverence reserved for those whose fame or wealth far exceeded his own. "Welcome to the Lexington Grand. Your penthouse suite is ready whenever you are." But Keanu did not take the offered hand. Instead, his eyes scanned the lobby, as if searching for something or someone. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured. "Did you recently turn someone away? A man in a gray coat?" Marshall blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Yes," he confirmed, recovering quickly. "Someone inappropriate tried to enter. We asked him to leave, for the comfort of our other guests." Keanu's expression remained neutral, but his eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. "That man," he said, "is Douglas Vance. He's a decorated war veteran who saved my uncle's life during his third tour in Iraq." Marshall's smile froze, a mask that no longer served its purpose. "He's also," Keanu continued, his voice even but carrying an unmistakable edge, "the reason your company exists today." The lobby fell completely silent. Even the ambient music playing through hidden speakers seemed to fade away. I don't understand," Marshall stammered, his composure cracking for the first time. Keanu shifted his bag to his other hand, his movements deliberate. "After retiring from military service, Douglas invested the little money he had into your startup during the 2008 financial crash. He was one of your first angel investors. He believed in your idea, when no one else did." The color drained from Marshall's face as realization dawned on him. The name Vance had appeared in the early investment documents, but he had never met the man in person. The early days of struggling to secure funding had long since faded from his memory, replaced by the comfortable narrative of his own business acumen and foresight. "And when I found out he was struggling," Keanu continued, "I invited him here today. To meet with me. To discuss something important." Marshall stood rooted to the spot, his entire carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. The irony was devastating. He had humiliated his own benefactor, the very person who had made his success possible. Keanu walked past him toward the glass doors, stepping back outside. The lobby watched in stunned silence as he approached Douglas on the bench and sat beside him. The two men exchanged a quiet handshake, and those watching could see Douglas's surprise gradually give way to recognition and then to a smile that transformed his weathered face. After a brief conversation, Keanu looked over his shoulder toward the lobby, his gaze finding Marshall, who stood framed in the doorway. "You judged him by his coat," Keanu said, the words simple but weighted with meaning. "I judge people by their character." He helped Douglas to his feet, then turned back to the stunned hotel staff and Marshall. "Tell the manager the penthouse is cancelled. We'll be staying somewhere else tonight, someplace where human dignity still matters." The impact of his words resonated through the lobby. One of the staff quietly mouthed, "That was Douglas Vance." The name suddenly carried weight, a story, a history that had been invisible moments before. Marshall stood, hollowed out, his arrogance shattered in front of everyone who mattered in his carefully curated world. The investors he had been so eager to impress now regarded him with poorly concealed disgust. The staff, previously deferential, now avoided his gaze entirely. As Keanu and Douglas walked toward the waiting Lincoln, Thomas, the doorman who had earlier refused to meet Douglas's eyes, hurried to open the door for them. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice thick with remorse. "I'm sorry, sir. I truly am." Douglas paused, studying the man's face. "Thomas," he said after a moment. "You've been here a long time." Thomas nodded, surprised to be remembered. 15 years this December, sir." "You were kind to my wife once," Douglas said quietly. "She forgot her medication, and you had someone run to the pharmacy." "I never forgot that." Thomas swallowed hard, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. "I didn't recognize you, sir." "Few people do, these days," Douglas replied without bitterness. "But that's all right. We all change." As they drove away, the Lexington Grand Hotel seemed diminished somehow, its grandeur revealed as something superficial, a shell without substance. Later that month, in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Los Angeles, a ribbon-cutting ceremony took place at a newly renovated building. The structure, once an abandoned community center, had been transformed into a state-of-the-art housing and resource facility for veterans struggling with homelessness and PTSD. Do you believe people can truly change? Comment yes if you do, no if you're still unsure. The funding had come anonymously, but those in attendance knew. Keanu Reeves and Douglas Vance stood side by side as the red ribbon was cut. The sign above the entrance read, "The Vance Center for Dignity and Renewal." Reporters gathered, cameras flashed, and Douglas, now dressed in a simple but well-fitting suit, spoke briefly about his journey from military service to financial security, then to loss and hardship, and finally to this moment of renewal. "Dignity," he said, his voice stronger now, carrying across the assembled crowd, is not something that can be taken from you. It can only be surrendered. And too often, we surrender it when we forget to see it in others. Keanu stood beside him, not as a celebrity but as a friend, his presence lending support but never overshadowing the man whose vision had created this place of healing. Marshall Trent wasn't there. But he watched the coverage on the news, sitting alone in his office, the television's glow the only light in the room. On his desk rested the photo of Douglas in uniform, a copy he had obtained after extensive searching, positioned where he would see it every day. The aftermath of that day at the Lexington Grand had been swift and merciless. The video of his encounter with Douglas, captured on multiple cell phones, had gone viral within hours. The investors he had been courting withdrew their interest. Several clients paused their contracts, citing re-evaluation of partnerships based on values alignment. His board of directors had called an emergency meeting. While they stopped short of removing him as CEO, the company was too closely associated with his name for that. They had insisted on immediate and substantial action to address the PR nightmare. Which was why, though he wasn't at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Marshall had approved the largest anonymous donation to the Vance Center. Not because it would salvage his reputation, that would take years, if it was even possible, but because, for the first time in decades, he had been forced to confront the man he had become. He remembered the early days of his company, working out of a cramped apartment, surviving on ramen and coffee, the constant rejection from investors who couldn't see beyond his youth or the market volatility. Then the mysterious investment from D. Vance that had arrived just when he was about to give up, the note attached simply saying, "I believe this matters. Make it count." He had never sought out the investor, assuming it was some distant relative of his mother's or perhaps someone his father had known through his military connections. The amount hadn't been large by current standards, but then, it had been enough to keep the lights on, to file the patent that eventually became the cornerstone of his empire. As the news segment ended, Marshall turned off the television and swiveled his chair to face the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. The city spread out below him, a tapestry of lights against the gathering darkness. He had achieved everything he had ever wanted: wealth, recognition, influence. Yet never had he felt so small, so insignificant. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant, reminder, meeting with the PR team at 7 p.m. to discuss community outreach strategy. Marshall sent a brief reply, then opened his desk drawer and removed a small, velvet box. Inside was his father's Purple Heart, awarded posthumously after he had died saving members of his unit in a conflict Marshall had been too young to understand. He had kept it hidden away, uncomfortable with the questions it raised about sacrifice and purpose. Now, he placed it beside the photograph of Douglas Vance. Two men who had served, who had given of themselves without expectation of return. Two men who understood something about dignity that Marshall was only beginning to grasp. The following morning, Marshall arrived at the Vance Center before dawn. He wore jeans and a simple sweater, clothes he hadn't worn in years. He had come alone, without security or assistance. He had come to work. The early shift staff, mostly veterans themselves who helped maintain the facility, were surprised to see him. They knew who he was, everyone did, after the video, but they accepted his presence with the same quiet dignity that seemed to permeate the building. He spent the day mopping floors, serving meals, listening to stories from men and women whose lives had been shaped by service and sacrifice. He did not offer explanations or apologies. He simply worked, his hands growing sore, his back aching from unaccustomed labor. As evening approached, he was cleaning the community room when Douglas Vance entered. The older man paused in the doorway, observing Marshall for a long moment before speaking. "You missed a spot," he said finally, his voice neutral. Marshall looked up, then back at the floor. "I've missed a lot of things," he replied. Douglas crossed the room and lowered himself into one of the chairs. "Why are you here, Mr. Trent?" Marshall set aside the mop and sat down across from Douglas, his posture reflecting the exhaustion of honest labor rather than the rehearsed confidence of the boardroom. "I don't know," he admitted. "To make amends, maybe. To understand." Douglas studied him, his blue eyes still clear and steady. "Understanding doesn't come from a day of cleaning floors." "No," Marshall agreed. "But it has to start somewhere." They sat in silence for a moment, two men from different worlds finding an unexpected intersection. "You invested in my company," Marshall said finally. "Why?" Douglas smiled faintly. "Your proposal mentioned facial recognition technology that could be adapted for finding missing persons, including veterans lost to homelessness and PTSD. It seemed like something worth supporting." Marshall's breath caught. That had been part of the original vision, yes, but it had been abandoned early on when more profitable applications emerged. He had forgotten that initial purpose, that promise made in the idealistic language of a younger self. "I never did that," he said quietly. "I never developed that application." "No," Douglas agreed. "You didn't." Another silence fell between them, heavier this time. "It's not too late," Douglas said finally. "You still have the resources, the knowledge." Marshall looked up, meeting the older man's gaze directly for the first time. "Would it matter? After everything?" Douglas considered the question seriously. Redemption isn't about erasing what was done. It's about creating something new from the understanding of it. He gestured around the room. "This place exists because people believe in second chances. Not just for those who receive help, but for those who give it." Marshall nodded slowly, a plan beginning to form in his mind. Not a PR strategy or a damage control measure, but something authentic, something that might, over time, restore not just his reputation but his humanity. 6 months later, the Vance Center launched a new program in partnership with Trent Technologies. The Homecoming Initiative utilized advanced facial recognition software specifically designed to identify and reunite homeless veterans with their families and support networks. The technology, provided at no cost to veteran support organizations nationwide, had already helped locate over 200 veterans who had been lost to the system. Marshall Trent still ran his company, but he spent every Wednesday volunteering at the Vance Center, no longer cleaning floors but teaching coding and technology skills to veterans interested in rebuilding their careers. His board of directors had initially been skeptical of his transformed priorities but had come around as the company's new focus on socially responsible applications began attracting a different kind of investor, those interested in long-term impact as well as profit. Keanu Reeves visited occasionally, without fanfare, often bringing along industry contacts who might provide employment opportunities for the center's residents. He and Marshall developed a cautious mutual respect, though neither ever referred directly to that day at the Lexington Grand. And Douglas Vance, whose quiet dignity had catalyzed this chain of transformation, continued to live simply but no longer in hardship. He maintained an apartment near the center, where he served as a mentor and living testimony to the possibility of renewal at any stage of life. The photograph of Douglas in uniform remained on Marshall's desk, not as a reminder of his failing but as a beacon pointing towards something better. Beside it now stood a new picture, the three of them, Douglas, Keanu, and Marshall, at the launch of the Homecoming Initiative, their expressions reflecting not the polished smiles of a publicity shot but the genuine satisfaction of meaningful work. In the lobby of the Lexington Grand Hotel, a small but significant change had also occurred. A discreet plaque now hung near the entrance, bearing a simple message. "In this place, we honor the dignity of every person. We recognize that true worth is carried within, not worn on the outside. We remember that every stranger has a story we have yet to hear." The hotel manager had initially resisted the installation, concerned about reminding guests of the infamous incident. But Marshall had insisted, not as the CEO of Trent Technologies but as a man learning, at last, the difference between the power of position and the authority of character. Never mistake someone's silence for insignificance. Never confuse appearance with worth. And never forget, true dignity is not worn on the outside. It's carried within. These truths, once mere platitudes to Marshall Trent, had become the foundation of a life being slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely rebuilt. Not through grand gestures or public atonement, but through the daily practice of seeing, truly seeing, the people around him. And in this seeing, he was, at last, beginning to find himself. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even tear up, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to remember the power of kindness and second chances. Let's make the Vance Center not just a place, but a message. If this story touched your heart, comment dignity to show the world what still matters. And don't forget to tag someone who needs to hear this today.